Every jail has rules, every jail has guards, and every jail is built on control. But on one island, in New York City, that control began to crack. Not with a riot, not with an explosion, but with silence. Empty posts, unlocked moments, too few guards, too many prisoners. Inside this jail, some officers stopped entering certain units, and some stopped coming at all. And slowly, the question changed. It was no longer, how do you control the prisoners? It became, who is controlling this jail? This is not a story from the past. This is not a warning. This is happening now. This is Rikers Island. And this is what happens when authority fades and fear takes its place. If you want to understand how control began to slip inside one of America's most infamous jails, keep listening. Rikers Island, a massive jail complex in New York City, is meant to be temporary. A place where people wait for their court dates, for their sentences. Most people held there have not been convicted. They are presumed innocent by law. But over the years, problems inside the facility grew deeper and more dangerous. These were not small problems that could just disappear. They became patterns that judges, lawyers, civil rights advocates, and city officials could no longer ignore. For decades, critics said Rikers operates under conditions that undermine safety and dignity. Independent watchdogs, oversight boards, regularly reported serious concerns about how the jail was run. Violence, overcrowding, poor staffing practices, inconsistent supervision. These were not rare occurrences, they were daily realities. Even after repeated warnings, even after legal orders, the problems persisted. In 2015, a major lawsuit brought by detainees led to a federal court order, a consent decree. It required the city to make wide-ranging reforms. Better training for staff, stronger control over violence, improved supervision of detainees, and regular reports to federal monitors to make sure the changes happened. The goal was clear: make Rikers safer, more humane, more consistent with the Constitution. But nearly a decade later, many problems remained. Independent monitors continued to issue harsh reports. Compliance with the court's rules was inconsistent or absent. Use of force incidents grew dramatically. In 2016, there were fewer than 5,000 reported incidents. By 2023, nearly 7,000. Stabbings, slashings, attacks with knives, all on the rise. By late 2024, a judge found the city of New York and its Department of Correction in contempt of court. Officials had ignored, delayed, or failed reforms. Security lapses, staffing shortages, broken supervision, violence, all had become routine. Guards, supervisors, were so used to these conditions, they barely noticed how dangerous things had become. When supervision is inconsistent and conditions are unstable, chaos can spread quickly. Rikers is massive, with dozens of housing units, hundreds of detainees in each. When officers are absent, posts left empty, supervision lapses, power can shift. Informal authority can emerge. Some detainees, those with connections, those who could command respect, begin to influence daily life. They decide who moves, who eats, who sleeps, who stays where. These shifts are unofficial, but they shape life inside the jail, silently, steadily, and dangerously. Staffing shortages worsen the problem. Even with massive resources, recruiting enough officers was a challenge. Thousands applied. Only a few graduated from the academy and entered the jail. Experienced officers left, retired, took leave. Reports said thousands were gone, or planning to leave, leaving critical gaps that would take years to fill. Remaining staff, exhausted, worked double, triple shifts, filling multiple roles at once. When posts went unfilled, housing units became vulnerable. These are the places where detainees spend most of their time, where safety depends on supervision. When officers were absent or overstretched, incidents escalated. Conflicts that might have been prevented grew into dangerous situations, unchecked, unresolved, spiraling. Exhaustion among staff grew. Fear crept in. Officers described the work as unsafe, relentless, overwhelming. Federal monitors wrote, unchecked absences and overworked staff were eroding the jail's ability to maintain order. Less staff meant slower responses, more tension, more fear. It was this combination of violence, of staffing shortages, of ignored court orders that forced the federal judiciary to step in. In May 2025, a federal judge stripped the city of full control over Rikers. Authority over the jail, over its officers, over its detainees, was handed to an independent remediation manager. This official had the power to rewrite rules, manage hiring, enforce training, discipline employees who broke policies. The court's message was clear: the old system had failed, and a new form of oversight was necessary. Even before the federal takeover, independent monitors documented dangerous conditions. Fire safety systems failed, equipment malfunctioned, emergency responses lagged. One lawsuit claimed detainees were locked in cells, while a fire burned nearby, thick smoke filling the halls with no evacuation. Lawyers said this violated constitutional rights, fire codes, and basic human safety. Deaths inside Rikers continued. Dozens over recent years, from illness, from self-harm, from incidents that could have been prevented. Oversight reports found lapses, failed protocols, gaps in supervision. The tragedy was not isolated. It was part of the everyday reality inside the jail. These patterns were not new. For decades, oversight tried to correct them. Decades of warnings, repeated monitoring, failed reforms, still, problems persisted. Staffing shortages, ineffective use of force policies, poor supervision, all continued. The court found clear evidence the Department of Correction had failed to make real progress, even after legal orders. By the 2020s, everyone knew authority was slipping. Officers felt powerless, detainees felt frustrated, oversight teams warned and warned and warned again. Finally, federal intervention recognized the reality. The old system was broken. Authority is the power to keep order, to ensure safety. When it starts to slip, it is rarely sudden. It begins with small failures. Doors left unlocked, posts unfilled, conflicts unresolved, warnings ignored. Slowly, the cracks widen, unnoticed, until chaos becomes normal. At Rikers, isolated issues grew into system-wide failure. Authority weakened, unpredictably, and everyone inside felt it first. This is not just numbers or court rulings. This is the lived reality. Guards overworked, detainees navigating chaos, oversight teams watching, warning, helpless. When ignored for years, conditions spiral until federal intervention becomes the only solution, because the old way was no longer enough to keep people alive, to keep order, to keep anyone safe. As the authority inside Rikers weakened, the balance of power began to shift. It did not happen all at once, but slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Officers who once walked the halls with certainty began to hesitate. They checked their posts, counted heads, watched for trouble, but fear was creeping in. Some started avoiding certain housing units. Units where tensions simmered, where fights had broken out before, where a single misstep could mean serious injury. Others, exhausted, frustrated, began calling in sick, leaving their colleagues alone, stretched thinner, forced to cover more ground, more cells, more people, more chaos. The detainees noticed this shift immediately. They could feel the hesitation, the absence of authority, the moments when doors were left unlocked, the gaps in supervision. And in those moments, they started taking control. They created unofficial rules, deciding who could move, when meals were shared, who would stay where at night, who would be watched, and who could walk freely. Influence grew quietly, then visibly, from whispers in the corridors to subtle commands in the housing units, to outright challenges to the few officers who dared to intervene. Officers described it as a slow erosion of control, a creeping fear, a growing tension that hung in the air like smoke. Some said they began to feel trapped, uncertain of when or if help would arrive. Backup was often delayed, stretched across other units, or simply unavailable. And with each passing day, the detainees' confidence grew, while the officers' confidence waned. Violence became a symptom of the instability, not the story itself. Incidents erupted, but they were no longer shocking. A punch, a shove, a slashing, and the officers were already wary, anticipating the next threat, always cautious, always on edge. They began to strategize around who they could safely confront and which situations to avoid entirely. It was a survival instinct, a response to the growing imbalance of power. In some housing units, Entire sections were controlled, quietly, by detainees who understood the weaknesses in the system. They knew which doors remained unlocked, which officers were afraid to enter certain areas, which posts were always left vacant. And they used that knowledge deliberately to influence life inside the jail. It was not chaos in the dramatic sense, it was organized, controlled, by those who knew the system better than the guards did. The few officers who tried to enforce order faced a stark reality. They could respond to an incident, but it often came at personal cost, a physical risk, a confrontation that could escalate quickly. And after one incident, they would think twice before stepping back into that same unit. Gradually, patterns formed. Some areas were avoided. Some units practically ceded to the detainees because the risk of intervention outweighed the capacity to maintain control. Over time, fear became contagious. Newer officers, freshly trained, learned to expect tension, conflict, uncertainty. They adapted by avoiding confrontation, by following routines mechanically, but cautiously, constantly aware that a single misstep could ignite a problem they could not contain alone. And the detainees, observing, adapting, exploiting every weakness, grew bolder, more confident, almost like a silent takeover, executed day by day, block by block. Even the leadership within the jail struggled to respond. Supervisors tried to redirect resources, move officers strategically, patch the gaps, but staffing shortages made it nearly impossible to cover everything. Every attempt to enforce authority, every effort to intervene, was undermined by the structural weaknesses: empty posts, exhausted staff, and detainees ready, waiting, watching. This created a strange, tense equilibrium. On one side, officers were overworked, cautious, fearful. On the other side, detainees were empowered, confident, quietly in control. It was a psychological war, fought not with grand gestures, but with presence, or the lack of it. A glance, a step, a door left open. Each became a statement. Each became leverage. And so the cycle continued. Each incident, each lapse in supervision reinforced the imbalance. Fear became self-fulfilling. Officers pulled back, detainees filled the space. The authority that should have held the jail together faded inch by inch, day by day, leaving a system that teetered on the edge. It was in this environment, fragile, tense, unpredictable, that Rikers earned its reputation. A place where the usual rules of authority seemed suspended. Outside observers, judges, lawyers, the public could read reports, see the numbers, but inside, it was lived experience. The officers navigating fear, the detainees exercising quiet control, every moment a negotiation, every corridor a test, every shift a high-stakes balancing act with consequences for failure, immediate and personal. This was no longer simply a jail. It was a place defined by the struggle for control, by the erosion of authority, by the psychological weight of constant vigilance. Every step, every interaction, every decision carried meaning. The jail was alive, in tension, in fear, in power shifting quietly from one side to the other. And through it all, the city watched. The courts watched, the federal monitors watched, waiting for intervention, waiting for reforms, waiting for the day when this delicate, dangerous, invisible balance would finally be addressed before more lives and more safety were lost. Rikers Island remains one of the most infamous jails in the world, a place where authority once held strong, slowly faded, and the balance of power shifted in ways most could not imagine. Years of mismanagement, of staffing shortages, of violence, left deep scars on both those who lived there and those who tried to maintain order. Federal intervention has brought oversight, reforms, a plan to rebuild, and yet the challenges remain. The jail is still a test of human endurance, of courage, of resilience, where every day is measured in shifts, cells, and the quiet struggle to survive. It is a place that reminds us how fragile systems can be, how quickly order can slip, and how critical it is to protect both those inside and those charged with keeping it safe. Rikers Island is more than a jail, it is a mirror of society, of justice, of human strength, and human vulnerability. And as the city, the courts, and the federal oversight continue their work, the story is far from over. Every report, every shift, every decision shapes what comes next. If this story taught us anything, it is that power, authority, and safety are never guaranteed. They must be earned, maintained, and constantly watched over, because when they fail, the consequences are immediate and profound. And so Rikers stands still, waiting, changing, haunted by its past, struggling toward a future where order and justice may finally find balance.